Detectives stood inside an abandoned house near where 13-year-old Crystal Surrell had been murdered. The walls were covered in disturbing messages. One sentence immediately caught their attention. "I killed Dorchester girl." Nearby was another word. Satin. At first glance, it looked meaningless. Just another piece of graffiti. But 13 years later, that one misspelled word would help solve a murder. This is the story of Crystal Surrell, the girl everyone called Cricket, and the mystery that refused to disappear. Crystal Surrell was 13 years old. She lived in rural Dorchester County, South Carolina. Friends and family described her as energetic, friendly, and well-liked. Like many teenagers, she had a routine. A path she followed. A normal life that seemed predictable. On the morning of November 7, 1990, she left for school as she always did. Nobody around her could have imagined that those ordinary moments would become the final known chapter of her life. The route to school included a shortcut through a wooded area. It was a familiar path. Students used it regularly. Witnesses later reported seeing Cricket heading toward those woods that morning. Nothing seemed unusual. No reports of a struggle. No screams. No immediate signs that anything was wrong. But something happened between the moment she entered that wooded path and the moment she should have arrived at school. Because Cricket never made it to class. At first, confusion set in. Maybe she had gone somewhere else. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. But as the hours passed, concern began replacing confusion. By evening, people knew something was very wrong. A 13-year-old girl had vanished. And nobody could explain why. The shift from missing child to something much darker happened quickly. The next morning, November 8, search efforts intensified. Friends, family, law enforcement, and volunteers desperately hoped to find her alive. Instead, they found a crime scene. Crystal's body was discovered in the wooded area. The discovery stunned investigators. This was not an accident. This was not a runaway case. This was murder. The scene revealed signs of a violent attack. Her clothing had been disturbed. A gag had been forced into her mouth. She had suffered multiple stab wounds to the neck. Investigators later determined that the cause of death involved asphyxiation and injuries sustained during the attack. The community's worst fears had become reality. A young girl had been killed on her way to school. And the person responsible had disappeared without a trace. Investigators photographed everything. The pentagram. The messages. The strange references to satanic imagery. And one oddly misspelled word. At the time, nobody knew whether any of it mattered. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. The case remained open. But progress was painfully slow. Leads came and went. Potential suspects were examined. Nothing produced the breakthrough detectives desperately needed. For Cricket's family, every passing year brought the same frustration. The murder had not been forgotten. But it had not been solved either. And eventually, many people wondered whether it ever would be. Then came the twist. The kind of development that completely changes a case. More than a decade after the murder, investigators began taking a fresh look at old evidence. Advances in forensic science were changing criminal investigations across America. Cases that once seemed impossible were suddenly solvable. Cold cases were being reopened. Evidence was being re-examined. And Crickett's case was among them. Investigators focused on someone who had been connected to the victim's world years earlier. A former schoolmate. A boy who had attended middle school with Crickett. His name was Brian Lamb. Back in 1990, Brian had been only 14 years old. Just 1 year older than Crickett herself. During questioning, investigators asked him to provide handwriting samples. One word they wanted him to write was Satan. Brian wrote Satin. Detectives froze. Because that wasn't how most people spelled the word. But it was exactly how it had appeared in the graffiti linked to Crickett's murder 13 years earlier. That detail immediately complicated the investigation. Detectives were no longer looking at an adult suspect. They were examining the possibility that another teenager had committed the crime. And if that was true, it raised an entirely new set of questions. Could a 14-year-old have carried out such a brutal attack? As investigators built their case, the timeline became increasingly important. They revisited witness statements. They analyzed physical evidence. They compared old information with newer forensic findings. The investigation slowly moved forward. Then, in 2003, nearly 13 years after Crickett's murder, authorities filed a juvenile petition alleging that Brian Lamb had committed the crime when he was a minor. The delay itself created legal complexity. Brian was no longer a teenager. He was an adult. In fact, he was 27 years old by the time legal proceedings began. Suddenly, prosecutors faced an unusual challenge. How do you prosecute someone for a crime allegedly committed as a juvenile when that person is now approaching 30? The legal process became almost as complicated as the investigation itself. Questions about jurisdiction emerged. Questions about juvenile versus adult court followed. The case moved through hearings and legal challenges before ultimately reaching trial. But for Crickett's family, those legal arguments weren't the focus. They wanted answers. After more than a decade, they wanted accountability. When the case finally reached a jury, prosecutors presented their theory of what happened on that November morning. The defense challenged the evidence. As with many cold cases, there were debates about reliability, memory, and the passage of time. After all, more than a decade had passed. Witnesses age. Memories fade. Evidence can become harder to interpret. Yet prosecutors believed the totality of the evidence pointed to one person. Brian Lamb. Jurors spent time weighing the facts. Examining testimony. Reviewing evidence connected to a crime that had occurred years before. Then came the verdict. Guilty. Brian Lamb was convicted of Crickett's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. For many people, that should have been the end of the story. Case closed. Justice served. But even after the conviction, the case continued raising uncomfortable questions. One of the most unsettling aspects wasn't simply who was convicted. It was how young everyone involved had been. Crickett was 13. The convicted killer was 14. 2 children. One murdered. One later sentenced to spend life in prison. That reality makes the case different from many other true crime stories. Because it forces people to confront questions that don't have easy answers. What happened in the mind of a 14-year-old that morning? Could anyone have predicted it? Could anyone have prevented it? And how many warning signs, if any existed, went unnoticed? Those questions linger long after the verdict. Today, more than 3 decades after Crystal Surrell's murder, her case remains remembered not only because of its brutality but because of its extraordinary timeline. A schoolgirl disappears on her way to class. A community searches for answers. Years pass with no arrest. Then, more than a decade later, a breakthrough changes everything. Cases like this remind us that some investigations never truly go away. Even when evidence sits untouched. Even when years pass. Even when hope begins to fade. Sometimes the truth waits. Quietly. Patiently. For the moment when investigators finally uncover the missing piece.